I sold my dignity for one night to save my brother. Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper, as she stood in the dim glow of a piano bar, her fingers hovering over the keys. A young black college student, she slaved as a part-time pianist and waitress, surviving on stale bread and cheap milk to pay her comatose brother's medical bills. Mocked for her worn clothes, sneered at as that poor girl by classmates, and dismissed with sly racial jabs, she carried her burdens alone. Yet when a billionaire CEO's cold offer promised salvation, her world spiraled into danger, betrayal, and a love she never expected. Will her heart find a home, or will prejudice shatter her dreams? Subscribe now for our latest stories and share where you're tuning in from. Stay till the end. This tale of resilience and romance will leave you breathless. The lecture hall buzzed with the low hum of voices, a sea of students sprawled across rows of polished wooden desks, their laptops glowing and phones flashing as they snapped selfies or scrolled through social media. In the back corner, tucked away like a shadow, sat a young black woman, her head bowed over a tattered notebook. Her fingers, calloused from long nights at a piano bar, clutched a stubby pencil, scribbling notes in a hurried scrawl. A half-eaten slice of dry bread and a carton of cheap milk sat beside her, her only meal of the day. Her sweater frayed at the shoulders hung loosely on her thin frame, drawing snickers from a group of students nearby. "Look at her," one whispered, loud enough to carry. "Thinks she's a scholar with that thrift store getup, probably straight from the projects." Another chuckled, tossing in a sly, "What's she even doing here? Shouldn't she be cleaning houses or something?" The words stung, laced with the sharp edge of racial disdain. But she kept her eyes down, her jaw tight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She was a junior at this prestigious university, clinging to a merit scholarship that barely covered her tuition. Every cent she earned went to the hospital where her older brother lay in a coma, his life tethered to machines after a devastating car accident 2 years ago. She worked nights at a dimly lit piano bar, her fingers coaxing melancholic melodies from an old upright piano, and days as a waitress, dodging spilled drinks and rude customers for meager tips. Her tuition was overdue, the bursar's office sending warning letters that threatened to end her academic dreams. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford, and hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at her as she forced down stale bread to keep going. The whispers grew louder. "She's always eating that same nasty bread," a girl sneered, her voice dripping with mockery. "What, is that her diet plan? Poor and proud?" The group laughed, and she pressed her pencil harder into the page, the leads snapping under the pressure. The heavy doors of the lecture hall swung open, and the room fell silent. A man strode in, his presence commanding every eye. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, he moved with the confidence of someone who owned the world. His sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes made the girls in the front row sit up straighter, whispering excitedly. "That's him," one hissed. "The CEO, the one who funds half this campus." He was more than a businessman. He was a guest lecturer, invited to share his insights on leadership and economics, his name synonymous with wealth and power. Students hung on his every move, but she barely glanced up, her focus locked on her notes. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, her body heavy from a late shift at the piano bar. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours, and the words on the page blurred as she fought to stay awake. He stepped to the podium, his deep voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Success isn't just numbers," he began, his tone measured but commanding. "It's about choices, hard ones. It's about understanding the human cost behind every decision." His words resonated, heavy with the weight of experience, but she struggled to keep up. Her hand trembled as she wrote, her vision swimming. The room felt too warm, the air too thick. She blinked, trying to steady herself, but the world tilted. Her pencil slipped, clattering to the floor, and she pitched forward, her body crumpling against the desk. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. "Oh my God," someone muttered. "Is she okay?" The whispers turned sharp, tinged with judgment. "Probably faking it for attention," a girl scoffed. "You know how they are, always pulling some stunt." He stopped mid-sentence, his cold eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. Without hesitation, he stepped down from the podium, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he moved swiftly toward her. The students parted, their murmurs fading into stunned silence. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing her arm with surprising gentleness. "Get water," he ordered, his voice firm but laced with concern. A student scrambled to obey, and he turned his attention back to her. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his for the first time. Up close, his face was striking, stern yet softened by a flicker of worry that caught her off guard. "You fainted," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "When did you last eat something real?" She shook her head, embarrassed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm fine, sir. Just tired." Her cheeks burned under his gaze, and she tried to sit up, wincing as the room spun again. He studied her, his eyes taking in her pale face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she clutched her notebook. He'd noticed her before, always in the back, always silent, her focus unbroken despite the mockery she endured. Now, seeing her up close, he saw the toll her life had taken, her thin frame, her worn-out clothes, the quiet strength in her eyes that refused to break. "Rest," he said, helping her sit upright. "Don't argue." The students watched, wide-eyed, whispering among themselves. It wasn't every day a man of his stature stopped a lecture for a student, let alone one like her. "What's he doing?" a girl muttered. "Why's he wasting time on her?" The words carried a venomous edge, a reminder of the invisible lines drawn by race and class that she crossed simply by existing here. He stood, his presence silencing the whispers, and returned to the podium. But his focus lingered on her, a strange pull tugging at him. She wasn't like the others, with their polished exteriors and easy confidence. There was something raw in her, a resilience forged in hardship that he couldn't ignore. She gathered her things, her hands shaking as she tucked the bread and milk into her bag, avoiding the stairs. The bell rang, and she slipped out of the hall, her head low, the weight of their words and his gaze pressing down on her. She didn't know why he'd cared, why he'd stopped for her, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Her brother's hospital bills loomed, her tuition hung in the balance, and the world kept turning, indifferent to her struggle. Yet as she walked across campus, the memory of his eyes, sharp, yet unexpectedly kind, lingered, a spark in the darkness of her relentless fight. The campus stretched out before her, a maze of ivy-covered buildings and manicured lawns, but it felt like a battlefield. She clutched her worn-out backpack, the memory of those piercing blue eyes lingering like an unwelcome guest in her mind. She didn't know why he'd stopped for her, why he'd cared enough to kneel beside her in that crowded lecture hall, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Her brother's hospital bills were a noose tightening around her neck, and the bursar's latest warning letter burned a hole in her bag. As she hurried toward the city's edge where neon lights and cracked sidewalks replaced the university's polish, she steeled herself for another grueling shift at the piano bar. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain, and she pulled her frayed sweater tighter, bracing for the long hours ahead. The piano bar was a dimly lit haven, its red velvet curtains and scuffed wooden floors, a stark contrast to the university's sterile halls. The air smelled of whiskey and faded perfume, and the soft clink of glasses mingled with the hum of conversation. She slipped behind the old upright piano in the corner, her fingers finding the keys with practiced ease. The notes flowed, mournful and slow, a blues melody that mirrored the ache in her chest. She was no stranger to hard work, but tonight her hands felt heavier, her body still weak from the morning's collapse. The crowd barely noticed her, their laughter and chatter drowning out the music, but she played on, each note a lifeline to keep her brother breathing. Halfway through her set, the door swung open, and a ripple of silence spread through the room. She didn't look up, but she felt the shift in the air, the way the crowd's attention turned. Footsteps approached, deliberate and unhurried, and she sensed a presence by the piano. Her fingers faltered, missing a note, and she glanced up. There he was, the CEO from the lecture hall, his navy suit pristine under the bar's soft lights. His blue eyes locked onto hers, unreadable but intense, and her stomach twisted. "Keep playing," he said, his voice low, carrying a quiet authority that made her obey despite herself. She resumed, her fingers trembling, the melody uneven as she tried to ignore the weight of his gaze. When her set ended, she stood, wiping her hands on her worn jeans, and moved to the bar to collect her tips. He was there, leaning against the counter, a glass of bourbon untouched in his hand. "You work here," he said, not a question but a statement, as if he'd known all along. She nodded, avoiding his eyes, her voice tight. "Yes, sir, it pays the bills." He tilted his head, studying her. "You fainted this morning, and yet here you are, playing into the night. Why push yourself like this?" Her throat tightened, the question cutting too close. She wanted to snap back, to tell him it was none of his business, but the exhaustion in her bones made her honest. "I don't have a choice," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My tuition's overdue. $20,000. And my brother, he's been in a coma for 2 years. The hospital bills don't stop." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of her words. The bar's noise faded into the background, and she felt exposed, her struggles laid bare before this man who seemed to belong to a different world. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I can help you. One night with me, and I'll give you $500,000, enough to clear your tuition, your brother's bills, and more." Her breath caught, the words hitting like a slap. Her heart pounded, a mix of shock and revulsion churning in her chest. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I can't. You're, you're my lecturer. How could I face you after that?" His lips curved slightly, not a smile but something colder. "I'm a guest speaker, not your professor. My time at the university is done. You won't see me in class again." Her excuse crumbled, and she gripped the edge of the bar, her knuckles paling. Shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. But the image of her brother's pale face, the beeping monitors, the hospital's relentless demands flashed in her mind. She swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "How could I live with myself?" He didn't flinch, his gaze steady. "Sometimes survival means making hard choices. You don't have to like me. Just take what you need." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to break in front of him. The bar's dim lights cast shadows across his face, making him look both dangerous and impossibly calm. Her hands shook as she turned away, her mind a storm of pride and desperation. I I need to think," she murmured, barely holding herself together. She finished her shift in a daze, the notes she played mechanical, her thoughts consumed by his offer. When the bar closed, she stepped into the cool night, her breath visible in the air. He was waiting outside, leaning against a sleek black car, his presence as commanding as ever. "Decide," he said simply, his voice cutting through the silence. Her heart thudded, her pride screaming to walk away, but the weight of her brother's life pressed harder. "One night," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Just one. For him." He nodded, extending a hand. She hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers in his, the contact sending a jolt through her. The car door opened, and she stepped inside, her world tilting toward a choice she could never undo. The next morning, the university campus buzzed with a different kind of energy. She walked through the halls, her head low, the weight of the night heavy on her shoulders. She'd sworn to forget it, to bury it deep, but the whispers followed her like a shadow. "Did you hear?" a girl said, her voice carrying across the cafeteria. "She's been cozying up to that CEO, probably trading favors for cash." Another laughed, her tone sharp with malice. "What else do you expect from someone like her? She's got no business here." The words, laced with racial venom, cut deep, but she kept moving, her books clutched tightly to her chest. At the center of the room stood the campus beauty queen, her designer dress gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She turned, her smile sharp as a blade. "So you think you can climb the ladder like that?" she said loudly, her voice dripping with scorn. "You don't belong in his world or ours." The crowd tittered, and she felt her cheeks burn, the shame of the night mingling with the sting of their judgment. She slipped into a lecture hall, hoping to disappear, but the whispers followed. "Sugar baby," someone muttered. The term spat like an insult. She sat in the back, her notebook open but untouched, her mind replaying the night. The sterile luxury of his penthouse, The way his touch had been both gentle and commanding. The way she'd hated herself even as she'd clung to the promise of salvation. She wanted to forget, to pretend it never happened. But his face lingered, those blue eyes that saw too much. And then, as if summoned by her thoughts, the lecture hall door opened and he walked in. Her heart stopped. He wasn't supposed to be here. He'd said his time at the university was done. Yet there he stood, his presence silencing the room, his gaze finding her in the crowd. She ducked her head, her pulse racing, as the whispers grew louder and the weight of her choice pressed down harder than ever. The lecture hall door swung shut behind him, his silhouette framed against the light, and her heart pounded as if it might break free from her chest. She ducked her head, her fingers clutching her notebook, willing herself to disappear into the sea of students. His presence, unannounced and impossible, felt like a spotlight on her shame, the memory of that night burning beneath her skin. She'd vowed to bury it, to sever the thread tying her to him, but his gaze found her, sharp and unyielding, as if he could see through her carefully built walls. The whispers of "Sugar Baby" echoed in her ears, and she slipped out of the hall the moment the lecture ended, her breath shallow, her steps quick. She couldn't face him. Not now, not ever. The city's neon glow awaited her, a refuge where she could lose herself in work and forget the man whose world she didn't belong to. The piano bar was quieter tonight, the air thick with the scent of spilled beer and cigarette smoke that clung to the faded red curtains. She sat at the old upright piano, her fingers coaxing a slow, haunting melody from the worn keys. The notes were her armor, a way to drown out the whispers that followed her from campus to the city's edge. Her shift stretched into the early hours, the crowd thinning until only a few stragglers remained, nursing their drinks in the dim light. She was bone-tired, her body aching from days of relentless work, but she pushed through, each chord a reminder of the hospital bills piling up for her brother. The clock above the bar read 2 a.m. when she finally gathered her tips, a handful of crumpled bills, and stepped into the alley behind the bar, her breath visible in the chilly night air. The alley was a narrow strip of shadow, flanked by overflowing dumpsters and graffiti-stained walls. She pulled her frayed sweater tight, her backpack slung over one shoulder, and started toward the bus stop. The city was asleep, its pulse faint under the hum of distant traffic. Her footsteps echoed on the cracked pavement, the only sound until a low rumble cut through the silence. A black van screeched to a stop at the alley's mouth, its headlights blinding her. Before she could react, the side door slid open, and 2 men in dark jackets lunged out. Her heart leapt to her throat, and she stumbled back, her bag slipping to the ground. "Don't scream," one growled, his voice rough as gravel, as he grabbed her arm. She twisted, panic surging, but a second man clamped a cloth over her mouth, the chemical smell choking her. Her vision blurred, her limbs grew heavy, and darkness swallowed her whole. She woke to the cold bite of concrete against her cheek, her wrists bound with coarse rope. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of rust and damp wood. She blinked, her head throbbing, and realized she was in a windowless warehouse, its walls lined with crates and flickering fluorescent lights. Other women huddled nearby, their faces pale with fear, their wrists bound like hers. Whispers passed between them, fragmented and terrified. "It's an auction," one murmured, her voice trembling. "If you're not sold, you're dead." Her stomach twisted, nausea rising as the reality sank in. She was trapped, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. The name Victor Stone floated through the whispers, a shadow she didn't know but feared instinctively. Heavy footsteps approached, and a man in a tailored suit stepped into the light. His face was angular, his eyes cold and calculating, a predator sizing up his prey. "You," he said, pointing at her, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "You're the one he cares about." She froze, her mind racing. "Who?" The man smirked as if reading her thoughts. "Don't play dumb. You're Hale's weakness." Her breath caught. The CEO. This was about him. The man leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Tell me, girl, what's a nobody like you doing catching the eye of a man like that? You think you're worth something just because he looked your way?" His words dripped with disdain, his sneer a reminder of the racial slurs she'd heard too often. She clenched her jaw, refusing to answer, her eyes burning with defiance. They dragged her to a larger room, its walls lined with masked figures seated in folding chairs, their eyes glinting with greed. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the murmur of bids. She was shoved onto a platform, the harsh light blinding her as a voice boomed, "Young, resilient, one of a kind. Bidding starts at $500,000. Her heart pounded, her bound hands trembling as she scanned the crowd, searching for a way out. The bids climbed, 600,000, 800,000, each number a chain tightening around her. "What's she worth?" A man in a mask called, his voice mocking. "Not much, looking like that." Laughter rippled through the room, sharp with the edge of prejudice, but she stood tall, her chin lifted, refusing to let them see her fear. The bids hit $1 million when a new voice cut through, calm and commanding. $2 million. The room fell silent, the auctioneer's gavel hesitating. She squinted into the shadows, her pulse racing, and saw him, the CEO, his suit immaculate, his face a mask of controlled fury. The auctioneer stammered, 2.5? But he raised a hand, his voice like steel. 3 million, final. The gavel slammed down, and the crowd erupted in murmurs. She was pulled from the platform, her knees weak, and guided through a side door by two men she recognized. His bodyguards, their faces grim but focused. They moved quickly, leading her through a maze of corridors until they reached a hidden exit, the cool night air hitting her like a lifeline. Outside in a quiet lot, he stood waiting, his eyes a storm of relief and rage. He crossed the distance in 2 strides, his hands steadying her shoulders. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low and raw, the first crack in his composed facade. Her lips trembled, tears blurring her vision. You paid 3 million, she whispered, her voice shaking. He looked at her, his gaze softening. "I would have paid more." Her chest tightened, his words sinking deep. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why risk this for me?" He hesitated, then spoke, his tone heavy with something she couldn't name. "Because I'm not just doing this out of duty. I feel something for you. Something I can't explain." Her heart stuttered, torn between fear and a flicker of warmth she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Before she could respond, one of his bodyguards stepped forward, his voice urgent. "We need to move. Stone's men are still out there." She stiffened, the name from the warehouse echoing in her mind. "Who's Stone?" she demanded, her voice sharp with fear. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. "A rival. He saw you with me and made you a target." The weight of his words crashed over her, the danger of his world suddenly all too real. She stepped back, her bound hands still trembling as a guard cut the ropes. "Your world," she said, her voice cracking. "It's too dangerous for me. I don't belong here." Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she turned, her steps unsteady, her heart screaming to run from the man who'd saved her, and the chaos he brought with him. She turned away from him, her steps unsteady on the cracked pavement, the weight of his world pressing against her like a storm she couldn't outrun. The night air was sharp, biting at her skin, but it couldn't cool the turmoil in her chest. His words, "I would have paid more," echoed in her mind, a confession that felt too heavy, too real. She didn't belong in his world of wealth and danger, where rivals like Victor Stone turned her into a pawn. Yet as she disappeared into the city's shadows, her heart betrayed her, tugging her back to the man who'd risked everything to save her. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus on the hospital, on her brother, on the life she'd fought so hard to hold together. But his shadow lingered, inescapable, as if fate had already woven their paths too tightly to unravel. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the linoleum floors. She sat by her brother's bedside, her hand clasped around his face pale and still beneath the tangle of tubes and wires. The steady beep of the monitor was her only comfort, a fragile promise that he was still here. She'd spent the day dodging whispers at the university, where the campus beauty queen's venomous taunts, "You think you can climb the ladder like that?" still stung, laced with the sharp edge of racial scorn. Now in the quiet of the hospital room, she let her guard down, her shoulders slumping. "I'm trying, Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But it's so hard." The weight of her choices, the night she couldn't forget, and the man who refused to let her go pressed down, threatening to break her. Across town in a glass-walled office towering over the city, he sat behind a sleek mahogany desk, his fingers drumming against the polished surface. The skyline glittered beyond the windows, but his mind was elsewhere, fixed on her. The woman who'd walked away, her words cutting deeper than he'd expected. "I don't belong here." He'd saved her from Stone's trap, but her rejection burned, a challenge to the control he wielded so effortlessly in boardrooms. He leaned back, his blue eyes narrowing as he stared at the ceiling. "Why her?" he muttered, the question gnawing at him. She wasn't like the polished women who flocked to his side, their smiles calculated, their motives clear. There was something raw in her, a strength that stirred something unfamiliar in him, a need to understand her, to know her story. He picked up the phone, his voice sharp. "Linda, I want everything on her. Family history, background, all of it. Dig deeper than last time." His assistant hesitated on the other end. "Sir, we've already pulled her file. Is there something specific?" "Just do it," he cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I need to know why she feels familiar." Hours later, a thick manila folder landed on his desk. Linda stood by, her expression cautious. "There's something new here," she said softly. "I didn't include it before because it seemed irrelevant, but—" She trailed off as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. His breath caught. Her father's name stared back at him, a name tied to a memory his own father had shared years ago. "My father knew them," he said, his voice low, almost disbelieving. Linda nodded. "Your father, Robert, was saved by her father in a construction site accident decades ago. A beam collapsed, and her father pulled him out, risking his own life. After that, your family quietly supported theirs. Medical bills for her mother, tuition for her brother, until your father passed and the support stopped." He leaned back, his mind reeling. The connection wasn't random. His father's voice echoed in his memory, a rare moment of vulnerability. "If you ever meet the Carter family, don't turn away. They saved me. Protect them." The pull he'd felt toward her, the inexplicable familiarity, wasn't just attraction. It was a thread woven through their families, a debt of honor he hadn't known he carried. He closed the folder, his jaw tight. "She's not just anyone," he said, more to himself than to Linda. "She never was." Meanwhile, at the university, she faced a new wave of hostility. The campus beauty queen, her blonde hair gleaming under the cafeteria's lights, stood at the center of a crowd, her voice carrying like a blade. "She's playing the victim, isn't she?" she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Acting all innocent. But we know how she's paying her bills. Girls like her always find a way, don't they?" The crowd snickered, the words dripping with racial undertones, and she felt her cheeks burn. She clutched her tray, her lunch, a stale roll and a carton of milk, feeling heavier than ever. She wanted to scream, to tell them they were wrong, but pride kept her silent. She slipped out, her heart pounding, the sting of their judgment a reminder of the night she couldn't erase. At home in her cramped apartment, with peeling paint and a single flickering bulb, she sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling. The hospital had called again, demanding another payment, and her tips from the piano bar weren't enough. She'd scraped together every cent, but the debt loomed, a mountain she couldn't climb. Her phone buzzed and she froze, expecting another bill. Instead, it was the hospital, but the voice was different, cautious, almost hopeful. "Miss Carter, your brother's condition. There's a new treatment plan. It's experimental, but it's showing results overseas. It's expensive, but someone's offered to cover it." Her heart stopped. "Who?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The nurse hesitated. "An anonymous donor. They insisted on privacy." She knew instantly. It was him. Anger and gratitude warred within her as she ended the call. She didn't want his help, didn't want to be his charity case, but the thought of her brother waking up, of seeing his smile again, cracked her resolve. She buried her face in her hands. tears spilling over. "Why can't you leave me alone?" she whispered, though she knew he wasn't there to hear it. The next day, she marched into the bursar's office, determined to pay what she could of her overdue tuition. The clerk looked up, surprised. "Miss Carter, your balance is zero. Not just this semester. Your entire tuition is paid through graduation. There's a scholarship in your name now." Her knees nearly buckled. "Who did this?" she asked, her voice trembling. The clerk smiled faintly. "A donor. They didn't leave a name." Her anger flared. She knew it was him, meddling again, pulling strings she hadn't asked for. That evening, she found him on campus, leaving a meeting with the dean. She stormed up, her fists clenched. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "My tuition, the treatment. Why can't you let me fight my own battles?" His blue eyes met hers, calm but piercing. "Because you shouldn't have to fight alone," he said, his voice steady. "You deserve a chance to breathe." Her chest ached, torn between fury and a flicker of warmth she didn't want to feel. "I'm not your project," she snapped, her voice breaking. "I don't need your pity." He stepped closer, his gaze softening. "It's not pity. It's respect." She turned away, her heart racing, his words echoing in her mind. At the hospital, she sat by her brother's side, watching his chest rise and fall. The nurse entered, her voice gentle. "The treatment started. He's stable, stronger than before." Tears pricked her eyes as she squeezed her brother's hand. "You're going to make it, Daniel," she whispered. But as she left the hospital, her thoughts drifted back to him, the man who'd saved her, paid her debts, and refused to let her go. She hated how his presence lingered, how his actions stirred something she wasn't ready to name. And yet, in the quiet of the night, a small part of her wondered if he saw her not as a burden, but as someone worth fighting for. What an emotional journey for Emily and Nathan, a story of resilience, love, and defying the odds. We hope their tale of overcoming prejudice and danger resonated with you, stirring your heart and sparking reflection. Did Emily's strength inspire you? How did Nathan's unwavering commitment make you feel? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments and let us know where you're tuning in from. Your feedback fuels our storytelling, and we're grateful for every moment you spend with us. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable ride. Your support means the world. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories that challenge, uplift, and captivate. Until next time, keep dreaming big and believing in love's power to break barriers. See you in the next tale.